There's a peculiar moment that arrives uninvited in the life of every thinking person. A moment when the comfortable furniture of your mind suddenly feels foreign. When the life you've been living reveals itself as a kind of performance you never consciously agreed to give. You're walking down a familiar street, perhaps, or sitting in your usual chair, and something shifts. The autopilot disengages. You become aware that you are aware, and in that instant, something is lost forever. You cannot return to the innocent sleep of pure action, pure reaction, pure being without this watching presence that now stands slightly apart from everything you do. This is the hidden cost that no one mentions when they speak glowingly of awakening, of consciousness, of seeing through the illusions. They tell you about the liberation, the clarity, the transcendence, but they rarely speak of what you must pay for admission to this new way of seeing. And the price is steep. The price is everything you thought you were. You see, consciousness is not simply an addition to your life, like learning a new skill or acquiring new information. It's more like a solvent that begins to dissolve the very structures by which you've organized your existence. You start to notice the scaffolding behind your personality, the conditional nature of your certainties, the arbitrary quality of the values you've held as absolute. And once you've seen the scaffolding, you can never quite lose yourself in the play again. The actor becomes aware of the stage, and the stage becomes aware that it is being watched. And suddenly, the whole production takes on a strange, hollow quality. Beautiful, perhaps, but no longer quite real in the way it once was. Think about the person you were before this awareness began its work. That person moved through the world with a kind of confidence that consciousness inevitably undermines. They knew who they were, or thought they did. They had opinions that felt solid, desires that seemed to arise from some authentic core of selfhood, fears that appeared to protect something real and precious. But consciousness, when it really gets going, reveals that this solid self is more like a convenient fiction, a story you tell to give coherence to a bundle of sensations, memories, and habitual responses that have no more inherent unity than the individual frames of a film have unity when they're sitting in a can, separate from the projector that will create the illusion of continuous motion. The Buddha spoke of this, though the full implications are often softened in translation. He pointed to the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of existence, but what he was really indicating was the peculiar suffering that comes from being aware enough to see through your own constructions, but not yet free enough to rest in that seeing. You're caught between two worlds, no longer able to believe fully in the conventional reality that society offers you, but not yet able to abide comfortably in the groundless ground of pure awareness. You've eaten from the tree of knowledge, and the garden is closed behind you. This is not the story we like to tell about spiritual awakening. We prefer the triumphant narratives, the sudden enlightenment, the cosmic consciousness, the sense of unity with all things. And yes, those experiences happen, those moments of grace where the boundaries dissolve and you taste something vast and luminous. But what we don't often discuss is what happens after those moments pass, when you return to the ordinary world of paying bills and washing dishes and navigating the complicated machinery of human relationships. You return changed, marked by what you've seen, but the world has not changed. You still have a body that gets sick and grows old. You still have a mind that generates endless commentary. You still have a personality that wants things, fears things, grasps at pleasure and pushes away pain. But now you're aware of it all. You're watching the whole circus, including the part of you that's watching. And this reflexive awareness creates a kind of distance, a gap between immediate experience and the one who experiences. Some spiritual traditions celebrate this gap as the birth of the witness, the awakening of the observing self. But others, perhaps more honestly, acknowledge that this witnessing can become its own form of prison, a subtle separation that prevents you from ever fully diving into life again. Consider what you lose when you become truly conscious. You lose the ability to be completely absorbed in your work, because part of you is always standing back, asking whether this work is meaningful, whether you're doing it for the right reasons, whether you're being authentic, or merely playing out another conditioned pattern. You lose the ability to love without reservation, because consciousness introduces doubt. You wonder if your love is real, or just biochemistry, projection, need disguised as connection. You lose the ability to believe in anything absolutely, because consciousness reveals the constructed nature of all belief systems, including the ones you've built around consciousness itself. You lose your innocence, and unlike the biblical version of this loss, there's no deity to blame, no serpent to curse. You've done this to yourself, or it's happened through you, which amounts to the same thing. The mechanism of consciousness, once activated, cannot be deactivated. You cannot unknow what you've learned to see. The best you can manage is a kind of strategic forgetting, a willful re-immersion in the distractions and dramas of everyday life. But even this feels different now. Even when you're lost in some pursuit, some passion, some relationship, there's a part of you that knows you're lost, that's aware of the losing itself, and this awareness colors everything with a faint sense of unreality. This is what the mystics sometimes call the dark night of the soul, though that phrase has been romanticized beyond recognition. The real dark night is not a dramatic spiritual crisis with demons and visions. It's quieter than that, more insidious. It's the slow realization that consciousness has made you a stranger in your own life. You sit at dinner with friends, and you're laughing and talking, and part of you is genuinely enjoying the moment, but another part is watching the whole scene from somewhere outside it, seeing the patterns, the egos at play, the subtle competitions, the unconscious scripts everyone is following, including you. And you can't turn off this seeing. You can't return to the simple pleasure of just being at dinner without this doubled awareness. The cost continues to accumulate. You lose the luxury of clear enemies and simple narratives. Consciousness reveals that the person who hurt you was operating from their own pain, their own conditioning, their own unconsciousness. It doesn't excuse what they did, but it complicates your relationship to it. You can no longer indulge in pure righteousness or pure victimhood. You see the whole system, the chain of cause and effect stretching back infinitely, and you find yourself implicated in it rather than standing apart from it in judgment. You lose the comfort of identifying with any fixed position, conservative or liberal, religious or secular, materialist or spiritual. Consciousness shows you the partial truth in each view and the blindness in all of them. You become intellectually homeless, unable to rest in any ideology or camp. This is supposed to be freedom, and in some ultimate sense perhaps it is, but in the meantime, it's also a kind of exile. You don't quite belong anywhere. You've become what some traditions call a wanderer between worlds. Even your relationship to your own body changes. Before this awareness, you simply were your body. Now you have a body, and sometimes you're in it, and sometimes you're watching it from a strange remove. You notice its habits, its cravings, its aversions. You see how it hijacks your attention with its demands, hunger, fatigue, desire, discomfort. You begin to sense that you're hosting this animal rather than being this animal, and while this realization can lead to greater compassion for the body's needs, it also introduces a gap, a dislocation. You're not sure anymore where you end and the body begins, or if there's any meaningful you apart from the body at all. And then there's the terrible clarity that comes regarding death. Before consciousness really penetrates, death is an abstraction, something that happens to other people, something in the distant future that you don't need to think about today. But consciousness won't let you maintain this convenient ignorance. It makes you aware, viscerally aware, that this body will cease to function, that this particular nexus of awareness that you call yourself will dissolve back into whatever mysterious source it arose from. And you cannot unknow this. You cannot return to the blessed ignorance that allows most people to move through their days without the shadow of mortality coloring every moment. Some traditions would tell you that this awareness of death is a gift, that it focuses the mind, that it teaches you to appreciate each moment, to live fully because life is brief. And there's truth in this. But there's also the darker truth that this awareness can make it difficult to take anything seriously, including your own projects and aspirations. If it's all going to end, if you're going to die, and everyone you love is going to die, and the sun itself will eventually burn out, then what's the point of any of it? Consciousness raises this question, And it doesn't provide an answer. It just leaves you sitting with the question, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime. The price of consciousness continues to reveal itself in layers, like peeling an onion that makes you weep with every layer removed. You begin to notice how much of what you call your life is actually a kind of negotiation with other people's expectations, with society's demands, with the invisible rules that govern how one is supposed to be. Before awareness, you played these games unconsciously, and because you were unconscious, they didn't feel like games. They felt like reality. But now you see the game, and seeing it changes everything. You recognize that the career you've built, the one you've invested years in, the one that defines how you introduce yourself at parties, is partly a response to forces that have nothing to do with any authentic calling. You chose this path because your parents approved, or because it promised security, or because you were good at it in school, or because it seemed prestigious, or because you couldn't think of anything better at the time. And now you're locked into it, or feel locked into it, and consciousness sits there pointing out the bars of the cage you've built around yourself. But the real twist, the cruel joke, is that consciousness also shows you that there's no authentic calling waiting behind the inauthentic one. There's no true self buried under the false self, no genuine vocation obscured by the fake career. It's constructions all the way down. The part of you that wants to quit your job and find your real purpose is just another voice in the committee, no more real or true than the voice that tells you to keep playing it safe. Consciousness reveals that you're not a unitary self with one true path, but a multiplicity, a parliament of competing impulses and desires, none of which can claim absolute authority. This realization can be paralyzing. If there's no true self to discover, no authentic path to follow, then on what basis do you make decisions? How do you choose what to do with your life? The unconscious person doesn't struggle with this question because they have certainty, however illusory that certainty might be. They know what they want, or think they know, and they pursue it with conviction. But consciousness dissolves certainty, and what replaces it is a kind of floating, a suspension in possibility that can feel more like drowning than freedom. You notice this same dissolution happening in your relationships. Before consciousness, you loved people simply, directly. They made you happy, or they didn't. You felt connected, or you felt alienated. But now you see all the ways your relationships are constructed, all the projections and expectations and unconscious contracts. You see how you've been using other people to fill holes in yourself, how you've been confusing need with love, how you've been relating to others through the distorting lens of your own conditioning. And once you see this, you cannot maintain the comfortable illusions that make relationships easier. You can't quite believe anymore in the soulmate myth, the idea that there's one perfect person out there who will complete you. Consciousness shows you that you're already complete, or that completion is not something another person can provide, or that the whole concept of completion is itself a fantasy. And this knowing, while perhaps spiritually mature, makes actually being in a relationship more complicated. You're aware of all the ways you're disappointing your partner, all the ways they're disappointing you, all the fundamental ways in which two separate nervous systems can never fully merge or fully understand each other. Some people, when they reach this stage of awareness, choose solitude. They withdraw from the complexity of relationship into the simplicity of being alone. And there's a certain logic to this. When you're alone, you don't have to negotiate, compromise, explain yourself. You don't have to pretend to be more certain than you are. You don't have to watch yourself performing love when part of you is wondering if love is even real or just a sophisticated form of mutual exploitation. But solitude brings its own costs. Consciousness, when you're alone with it, can become overwhelming. Without the distractions of relationship, without the demands of others to pull you out of your own head, you can spiral into increasingly abstract and ultimately sterile forms of reflection. You think about thinking about thinking. You watch yourself watching yourself. The hall of mirrors extends infinitely, and there's no one there to interrupt the recursion, to bring you back to the simple fact of embodied existence. This is one of the great paradoxes consciousness presents. You need others to stay sane, to stay grounded in the shared world of human meaning. But truly meeting another person, truly connecting, seems to require a kind of unself-consciousness that awareness has taken from you. You're caught between the isolation of pure consciousness and the dissatisfaction of unconscious connection. Neither fully satisfies. Neither feels like home. And then there's the question of purpose, which consciousness destroys with particular efficiency. Before awakening, you might have believed that your life had a purpose, that you were here for a reason, that the universe had some plan or intention for you. Maybe you framed this in religious terms, God's plan, or in secular terms, your unique contribution, your legacy. But consciousness undermines these narratives by showing you the vastness of the cosmos, the insignificance of human concerns on the scale of galactic time, the way meaning is something minds project onto a universe that is, in itself, meaning neutral. This can lead to what we might call existential vertigo. You're standing on a planet spinning through space, alive for a cosmically brief moment, capable of asking questions that have no answers. Why are you here? What should you do? Does any of it matter? Consciousness raises these questions, but provides no comfortable resolution. The best it can offer is the suggestion that the questions themselves are the problem, that you're asking for a kind of meaning that doesn't exist and never did. But knowing that the question is problematic doesn't make it go away. You still wake up each morning and have to decide how to spend your finite time and energy. You still feel the pull of different possibilities, the weight of decisions, the anxiety about whether you're wasting your life. And without the anchoring certainty of purpose, these decisions become agonizing. Every choice forecloses other possibilities. Every path taken is 1,000 paths not taken. And consciousness makes you acutely aware of this, makes you feel the full weight of your contingency, your freedom, your responsibility for a life that no one else can live for you. Some spiritual traditions promise that if you push through this difficult phase, if you continue with your practice, you'll reach a place beyond these struggles, a state of acceptance, of surrender, of being at peace with the groundlessness. And perhaps this is true. Perhaps there is a consciousness beyond self-consciousness, an awareness that doesn't create the watching distance that's so painful. Perhaps there's a way to be fully awake and fully immersed at the same time, to see through the illusions without becoming alienated from life. But getting there, if it's even possible, requires traversing a desert of doubt and disillusion. It requires sitting with the anxiety of not knowing, of not being able to return to comforting beliefs, but not yet arriving at any kind of stable awakening. You're in between, in the liminal space that consciousness opens up, and this space can feel unbearable. The old world is gone, but the new world hasn't yet materialized. You're like a snake that's shed its skin, but the new skin hasn't hardened yet. Vulnerable, tender, exposed. Consider what consciousness does to your relationship with pleasure. Before awareness, you could lose yourself in pleasurable experiences, good food, beautiful music, sexual intimacy, the satisfaction of accomplishment. These moments provided relief from the difficulties of life, islands of genuine enjoyment in the sea of struggle. But consciousness introduces a serpent into every garden of pleasure. Even as you're enjoying something, part of you is aware that you're enjoying it, aware that the enjoyment will end, aware that you're grasping at the experience, trying to hold on to it, which creates tension that undermines the very pleasure you're seeking. You become aware of the hedonic treadmill, the way satisfying one desire just creates another. You see how pleasure and pain are linked, how every high is paid for with a corresponding low, how the pursuit of pleasant experiences is ultimately futile because they're all temporary, all subject to change. This awareness is supposed to free you from chasing after ephemeral satisfactions, but in practice, it often just makes you unable to enjoy anything fully. You're always standing slightly apart, watching yourself try to enjoy yourself, and this watching is itself a form of suffering. Even art and beauty, which might have once transported you, become complicated by consciousness. You look at a painting, and part of you is moved by it, but another part is analyzing it, thinking about the artist's technique, the cultural context, the market forces that determine what gets seen and valued. You listen to music, and even as your body responds, Your mind is deconstructing it, noticing the chord progressions, the production choices, the way it's manipulating your emotions. You can't surrender completely anymore. You can't be taken over by aesthetic experience because consciousness won't let you forget that you're being taken over. And this awareness creates a barrier, a thin membrane of separation that stands between you and the immediate impact of beauty. The same thing happens with nature. You walk in the forest and it's beautiful, truly beautiful, but you're aware that you're having an experience of beauty, aware that you're a consciousness contemplating trees, aware that the sense of peace you're feeling is partly a neurochemical response to being away from urban stimulation. Even here, in what should be the most direct encounter with reality, consciousness interposes itself. You cannot simply be in nature. You're always a self, observing nature, having an experience that you're aware of having. This intensification of self-consciousness brings with it a peculiar form of loneliness that has nothing to do with the presence or absence of other people. You can be surrounded by friends, engaged in animated conversation, genuinely connected at some level, and still feel this deeper isolation. The isolation of being a point of awareness that can never fully merge with other points of awareness, that is ultimately trapped within the prison of its own subjectivity. Consciousness makes you aware that you are always, inescapably, alone with your experience of reality. You cannot share it directly. You cannot step outside your own consciousness and experience what another person experiences. All you can do is use words and gestures to create a simulation of shared understanding, but the actual quality of your inner life remains private, inaccessible, sealed within the boundaries of your particular nervous system. This realization can make even the most intimate moments feel like a kind of cosmic joke. You're making love with someone, as close as two human beings can physically be, and consciousness steps in to whisper that you're still separate, that you're each lost in your own sensations, your own fantasies, your own interior movie. You're making love to your idea of the other person as much as to the actual person. You're performing a version of yourself that you hope will be attractive, desirable, lovable. Even in the midst of passion, consciousness reveals the stage machinery, the elaborate performance that goes into creating the illusion of union. And it's not that the connection isn't real. It is real as anything else in this strange existence. But consciousness won't let you have it simply, directly, without this awareness of its constructed nature. You're always observing yourself connecting, which means you're never fully connected. You're divided, split between the part that experiences and the part that watches the experiencing. This is the fundamental duality that consciousness introduces, and once it's been introduced, it cannot be easily resolved. Some mystics speak of transcending this duality, of reaching a state of non-dual awareness where the observer and the observed merge into a single field of consciousness. And perhaps this is possible. Perhaps there are moments, or even sustained periods, where the watching distance collapses and you simply are, without the reflexive self-consciousness. But for most people, most of the time, consciousness means living in this divided state, always watching, always aware, always separated from direct experience by the thin film of awareness itself. The cost of this becomes apparent in strange ways. You lose the ability to be spontaneous, because spontaneity requires a kind of self-forgetting that consciousness prevents. You're always calculating, even when you're trying not to calculate. You're always aware of how you're coming across, what impression you're making, whether you're being authentic or just performing authenticity. Even your attempts at spontaneity become self-conscious. You try to be natural, which of course is the least natural thing possible. You try to let go, but trying to let go is itself a form of grasping. This trap reveals itself with particular clarity in spiritual practice. You meditate, hoping to quiet the mind, to reach some state of peace or clarity. But consciousness turns meditation into another performance, another project. You're watching yourself meditate, evaluating how well you're doing, comparing this session to previous sessions, hoping for some breakthrough, some dramatic shift in your state. And all of this watching and hoping and evaluating is precisely what prevents the very thing you're seeking. You cannot force yourself into presence. You cannot think your way out of thinking. You cannot use consciousness to transcend consciousness. Yet the alternative, giving up the search, accepting where you are, is equally problematic. Because consciousness, once awakened, creates a kind of divine discontent. You've tasted something beyond the ordinary, even if only briefly. You've had moments where the watching stopped, where you were simply here, now, alive, without the burden of self-consciousness. And having tasted this, you cannot be satisfied with the default mode of constant mental chatter and divided awareness. You're spoiled for the ordinary life you used to lead, but you haven't stabilized in the extraordinary life you've glimpsed. This is the gap where most seekers spend most of their time, between the old life that no longer satisfies and the new life that hasn't yet fully emerged. And consciousness makes this gap painful by constantly pointing out that you're in the gap, that you're still seeking, still dissatisfied, still not where you want to be. Even your dissatisfaction becomes self-conscious. You're aware that you're unhappy about being unhappy, which creates a second layer of unhappiness. You're aware that you're seeking, which makes you question whether the seeking itself is the problem. But even this questioning is another form of seeking, another move in the endless game consciousness plays with itself. The traditions speak of enlightenment as the end of seeking, but what they rarely emphasize is that most people never reach this end. They spend their entire lives in the middle game, aware enough to be unsatisfied with unconscious living, but not aware enough to rest in pure being. They've paid the price of consciousness, given up the innocent immersion in life, but they haven't received the promised compensation, the liberation, the peace, the final understanding. This is perhaps the deepest cost. Consciousness can become a burden you carry for your entire life without any final resolution. You might have peak experiences, moments of grace, periods of relative peace, but the fundamental duality persists. You remain a self, observing itself, trying to understand itself, trying to free itself, and this very trying is what maintains the bondage. You're like a character in a dream trying to wake up, not realizing that the trying itself is part of the dream, that the one who wants to wake up is also a dream figure. Consider what this does to your relationship with time. Before consciousness, you lived mostly in the present or in anticipation of the future. You were engaged with what was happening or planning what you would do next. But consciousness introduces a constant retrospective awareness. You're always reviewing what just happened, evaluating your performance, replaying conversations in your mind, wondering if you said the right thing or came across the way you intended. You're haunted by the past, even the immediate past, even the past of 5 seconds ago. And simultaneously, consciousness makes you anxious about the future in a new way. It's not just that you worry about whether things will go well. You worry about whether you'll be able to handle it when things go well or poorly, whether you'll respond skillfully, whether you'll maintain your awareness or get lost in unconscious reaction. You're worried about your future state of consciousness, about whether you'll be able to sustain the witnessing perspective in difficult situations. The content of your concerns has shifted from external circumstances to your own interior condition. But this shift doesn't make the anxiety less. If anything, it makes it worse, because now you feel responsible for your state of consciousness in a way that's ultimately impossible to control. Time itself feels different under the lens of consciousness. The present moment, which spiritual teachings tell you is all you ever have, becomes almost impossible to locate. By the time you notice you're in the present moment, you're already in the past, already remembering being present a moment ago. The present is always slipping away even as you try to grasp it, and consciousness makes you acutely aware of this slippage. You cannot hold on to now. It's already become then. And this creates a subtle anxiety, a feeling that life is escaping you even as you're living it, that you're always arriving a moment too late to catch yourself in the act of pure existence. Some teachers respond to this dilemma by pointing out that the one who's trying to be present is itself a mental construct, that true presence happens when this trying ceases. But consciousness makes it nearly impossible to cease trying without turning ceasing into another form of trying. You try to let go of trying. You try to surrender. You try to accept. and each attempt maintains the very dynamic you're trying to escape. You're like someone trying to fall asleep, discovering that trying prevents sleeping, but unable to stop trying without making the effort to stop trying, which is of course another form of trying. This recursive trap is maddening, and consciousness ensures that you're fully aware of being trapped. You can describe the trap, analyze it, understand it intellectually, but understanding doesn't free you. If anything, understanding can make the trap more elaborate, more subtle. You develop sophisticated spiritual concepts, complex theories about how awakening works, detailed maps of consciousness. But all of this knowledge is just more content in consciousness, more furniture in the prison cell that might make the cell more comfortable, but doesn't help you find the door. The peculiar suffering of consciousness extends into realms that at first seem mundane, but reveal themselves as profoundly existential. Take, for instance, the simple act of making breakfast. Before awareness, this was just something you did, automatic, habitual, unremarkable. But consciousness transforms even this ordinary act into a theater of self-observation. You're not just making breakfast. You're watching yourself make breakfast, while simultaneously questioning whether you're doing it mindfully or mechanically, whether you're present with the experience or lost in thought. You notice that you're noticing, and then you notice that you're noticing that you're noticing, and suddenly the simple task has become a Chinese box of recursive awareness that leaves you feeling oddly exhausted before the day has even begun. This invasion of consciousness into every corner of life means that there's no respite, no activity that remains innocent of self-observation. You're brushing your teeth and wondering if you're brushing them with awareness or doing them automatically while your mind wanders. You're washing dishes and questioning whether you're truly present with the sensation of warm water and soap, or merely performing presence while actually being lost in mental narrative. Even rest becomes complicated. You lie down to relax, and immediately consciousness chimes in to ask whether you're truly relaxing or just thinking about relaxing, whether you're allowing yourself this rest or feeling guilty about it, whether this downtime is earned or evidence of laziness. The exhaustion that comes from this constant monitoring is real and significant, though it's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's as if you're living your life while simultaneously writing a documentary about living your life, with a running commentary that never stops, never takes a break, never lets you simply be without evaluation. And the cruel irony is that you know this commentary is itself the problem, that the watching is what prevents direct experience, but you cannot stop watching without watching yourself try to stop watching. This extends into your creative work in particularly crippling ways. If you write or paint or make music, consciousness can paralyze the creative flow by introducing constant evaluation. You're not just writing a sentence, you're judging whether it's good enough, whether it captures what you mean, whether it will be understood or misunderstood, whether it's original or derivative, whether it reveals too much or too little of yourself. The spontaneous flow that creativity requires is constantly interrupted by these evaluative voices, all of which are manifestations of heightened consciousness, of the awareness that watches and judges everything you do. And you cannot simply tell consciousness to be quiet, because consciousness is not something separate from you that takes orders. It's not an entity you can negotiate with. It's the very structure of how you experience reality now, the inescapable condition of your awareness. Telling consciousness to stop being conscious is like telling your eyes to stop seeing or your ears to stop hearing. The faculty, once developed, cannot be undeveloped. You cannot regress to a less aware state through an act of will, because will itself is an expression of consciousness. This realization that you cannot go back can trigger something like grief. You mourn the loss of the person you were before, the one who could act without this constant self-surveillance, who could believe things wholeheartedly, who could throw themselves into projects and relationships without the whispered doubt of consciousness in the background. That person is dead, or never existed in the first place, and you're left with this newer, more aware version of yourself that sometimes feels like a curse disguised as a blessing. The traditions speak of blessings and curses as if they're opposites, but consciousness reveals them as two sides of the same coin. To see clearly is both liberating and binding. To understand deeply is both enlightening and darkening. Every gift consciousness offers comes wrapped in a cost. Every insight creates a new problem. Every answer generates 3 new questions. You're ascending and descending simultaneously, growing and shrinking, becoming more and less at the same time. This paradoxical quality of consciousness shows up in your relationship with truth. Before awareness, you could hold certain truths as absolute, as foundations on which to build your life. But consciousness dissolves absoluteness. It shows you that every truth is context-dependent, perspective-bound, valid from one angle and invalid from another. This could be experienced as intellectual flexibility, as nuanced understanding, but it can also feel like standing on quicksand. Without any fixed truths to anchor yourself to, every belief becomes provisional, every commitment contingent, every value negotiable. You find yourself unable to be a fundamentalist about anything, which means you're also unable to be fully committed to anything. You can see the Buddhist's point and the Christian's point and the materialist's point, and this seeing prevents you from planting your flag on any particular hill. You become a perpetual diplomat, always able to see both sides, always conscious of the limitations of every position, including your own. This might make you wise in some sense, but it also makes you homeless in another. You don't have an intellectual country to call your own. You're a citizen of nowhere, a believer in nothing absolute, a perpetual questioner who questions even the value of questioning. And yet, despite this erosion of certainty, consciousness also makes certain things painfully clear. You see the suffering in the world with eyes that cannot look away. You notice the violence, the exploitation, the unnecessary cruelty that runs through human systems and relationships. You're aware of your own complicity in these systems, the way your comfort depends on others' discomfort, the way your privilege rests on foundations of historical and present injustice. This awareness creates a moral weight that's difficult to bear. The unconscious person can participate in these systems without much internal conflict, because they don't see them clearly, or they've convinced themselves of necessary justifications. But consciousness won't grant you these comfortable illusions. It shows you the true cost of your lifestyle, the real impact of your choices, the ways you're entangled in vast networks of harm, even as you consider yourself a good person with ethical values. And this knowing creates a burden of responsibility that can feel crushing. You want to do something about it, to live more ethically, to reduce the harm you cause. But consciousness also shows you the futility of individual action in the face of systemic problems, the way your small choices barely make a dent in the massive machinery of global exploitation and environmental destruction. You're caught between the imperative to act that consciousness creates and the awareness that your actions are largely meaningless in the bigger picture. Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. Guilty for participating, and guilty for not doing enough to change the participation. This moral consciousness can become its own form of torment. You're constantly evaluating your choices through an ethical lens that reveals problems in everything. You can't buy food without wondering about the labor conditions of farm workers. You can't use electricity without thinking about climate change. You can't wear clothes without considering the sweatshop workers who made them. Every moment of consumption becomes weighted with awareness of its real costs, and while this awareness is arguably what any ethical person should have, it makes the simple act of living in modern society an exercise in moral compromise. Some people respond to this by trying to live more purely, more ethically, more consciously. They become vegetarian or vegan. They buy only fair trade products. They reduce their consumption. They try to minimize their footprint. And there's integrity in this response. But consciousness, being what it is, doesn't let you feel entirely good about even this. It points out the ways your purity is itself a kind of privilege, that you can afford to be ethical because of economic advantages that others don't have. It notices the subtle pride that can creep into ethical living, the way you might judge others who aren't as conscious as you are. It reveals that even your attempts at righteousness are contaminated by ego, by the desire to feel like a good person, by the need to distinguish yourself from the unconscious masses. There's no winning this game. Consciousness has rigged it so that every move you make can be seen as problematic from some angle. You're either too engaged with the system or too detached from it, too concerned with changing the world or too focused on your own spiritual development, too critical of others or too lenient, too rigid in your principles or too flexible. The watching mind can always find a fault, always detect a contradiction, always locate the ego operating behind even your most selfless acts. This relentless capacity for self-criticism that consciousness enables can corrode your relationship with your own goodness. Before awareness, you might have done kind things without much thought, helped a neighbor, donated to a cause, listened to a friend in distress, and these acts carried a simple quality of rightness. But consciousness introduces doubt even here. When you help someone, part of you is immediately questioning your motives. Are you doing this because you genuinely care or because you want to feel like a good person? Are you giving freely or expecting something in return, even if it's just the internal reward of feeling virtuous? Are you truly present with the other person's suffering, or are you already imagining how you'll tell this story later, how it will reflect well on you? This interrogation of motive is exhausting and ultimately unanswerable. Motives are mixed. Every act arises from a complex web of causes and conditions, some noble and some base, some conscious and some hidden, even from yourself. Consciousness reveals this complexity, but provides no clear way to navigate it. You cannot purify your motives through effort, because the effort to purify itself comes from the ego's desire to be pure, which taints the purity you're seeking. You're caught in another version of the recursive trap, where trying to be good prevents you from simply being good in an unself-conscious way. Some spiritual traditions address this by emphasizing the cultivation of bodhicitta, the awakened heart that acts from compassion without thought of reward or recognition. They suggest that through practice, you can reach a state where ethical action flows spontaneously, without the divided consciousness that questions every move. But getting there requires traversing the territory of painful self-awareness, where every impulse is suspect and every generous act is revealed to have selfish components. This phase of spiritual development can make you less functional rather than more. You're paralyzed by awareness of your own impurity. You cannot act naturally because consciousness has revealed that natural action is always a mixture of drives, some of which you'd rather not acknowledge. The part of you that wants recognition sits next to the part that genuinely cares. The desire to be seen as generous coexists with authentic generosity, and consciousness won't let you ignore these uncomfortable companions. It insists you see the whole truth, which often makes action more difficult rather than easier. Think about how this affects your relationship with success and achievement. Before consciousness, you could pursue goals with straightforward ambition. You wanted to succeed, and you worked towards success, and if you achieved it, you felt satisfaction. But consciousness complicates this simple picture. It makes you question why you want what you want. Are you pursuing this goal because it's genuinely meaningful to you, or because it will impress others? Are you trying to prove something to yourself, to compensate for some deep sense of inadequacy? Are you running towards something, or away from something? And even if you achieve the goal, consciousness won't let you enjoy the achievement without asking whether your satisfaction is based on ego inflation, whether you're defining yourself by external markers of success, whether you've bought into a cultural narrative about achievement that ultimately doesn't serve your deepest well-being. The result is a kind of motivational ambivalence. You want things, but you're suspicious of your wanting. You work toward goals, but you're not sure if they're the right goals. You achieve things, but you can't quite celebrate because consciousness points out all the ways your achievement is arbitrary, lucky, built on privilege, not as impressive as you'd like to think. You've become a perpetual doubter of your own experience, unable to trust that what you feel is what you should feel, unable to rest in any state because consciousness always finds something questionable about it. This extends to your social identity in profound ways. Who you are in the world, your gender, your race, your nationality, your class, your profession. All of these identity categories that previously seemed natural and stable are revealed by consciousness as constructions, performances, arbitrary divisions that society has taught you to believe in and enact. You become aware that you're playing a role, that the person you present to the world is a kind of character you've developed based on countless social interactions and feedback loops. And once you see that you're playing a character, the character becomes unstable. You cannot inhabit your social identity with the same unconscious ease. You're always aware of the performance, always conscious of the ways you're conforming to or rebelling against social expectations. Even when you try to be authentic, you're aware that authenticity itself is a performance, that the real you're trying to express is just another construction, another story you tell about yourself. This can lead to a kind of identity vertigo. Who are you really, beneath all these layers of performance and construction? The more you look for an essential self, the more it eludes you. You find only more layers, more stories, more constructed identities, all the way down. Consciousness reveals that you're not a solid, unified self, but a process, a continually shifting pattern of thoughts, feelings, sensations, and reactions that you've learned to call I, but which has no more inherent unity than a river has unity. It's just a convenient name for a flow of water that's never the same from one moment to the next. Some traditions would say this realization of no self is liberating, and perhaps ultimately it is. But the intermediate stage, where you've lost the illusion of solid selfhood but haven't yet learned to function fluidly without it, is disorienting and often frightening. You feel like you're disappearing, like the ground is falling away beneath your feet. If there's no essential you, then who's making decisions? Who's responsible for actions? Who's the one that's trying to awaken? The questions spiral, and consciousness watches them spiral, offering no answers, only more refined observations of the questioning process itself. You begin to suspect that the problem is not that you haven't found the right answers, but that you're asking the wrong questions, that the whole framework of seeking an essential self or ultimate truth is fundamentally mistaken. But even this suspicion doesn't free you from the seeking. You still get up in the morning and live a life that requires some sense of continuous identity, some working assumption that the person who went to sleep last night is the same person who woke up this morning, even though consciousness has thoroughly undermined any literal belief in this continuity. You start to live a kind of double life. On the surface, you function like everyone else. You have a name, a history, preferences, relationships, responsibilities. You move through the world as if you're a continuous self, because that's how the world works, how language works, how social interaction works. But underneath, you're aware that this is all a kind of useful fiction, a pragmatic construction that has no ultimate reality. You're playing along with the game while knowing it's a game, and this double consciousness creates a subtle but persistent sense of unreality, of not being quite real yourself, of going through the motions of a life without fully believing in the life you're living. This sense of unreality can be profound and disorienting. Nothing seems quite solid anymore. Your relationships feel simultaneously precious and empty. Precious because they're all you have. Empty because consciousness has shown you the contingent, constructed nature of every connection. Your work feels simultaneously important and meaningless. Important because it structures your days and provides purpose. Meaningless because consciousness keeps asking what any of it matters in the long run. You're living in a world that has lost its sense of absolute reality, where everything is real enough for practical purposes, but nothing is quite real in the way you once assumed it to be. And yet, within this unreality, within this dissolution of certainty and solidity, something else begins to emerge if you can stay with it long enough. The cost of consciousness, having been fully paid, starts to reveal what might be its compensation, though calling it compensation suggests a trade that was consciously made, when really it's more like discovering that the journey itself was the destination, that the price and the prize were never separate. What emerges is a kind of freedom, but not the freedom you imagined when you first started questioning, first started seeking. It's not freedom from consciousness or freedom from the struggles that consciousness brings. It's something more subtle and more radical, a freedom within the struggle, a way of being with the burden that transforms the burden into something else entirely. something that's not exactly burden and not exactly liberation, but some third thing that doesn't have a good name in any language. You notice that the watching itself can be watched. The consciousness that observes your experience is itself an experience that can be observed. This creates a kind of infinite regress that logic tells you should lead nowhere, but experientially it opens something up. When you watch the watcher loses its solidity. It's no longer this fixed observing point, but another fluid phenomenon arising and passing in awareness. And if the watcher is itself just another experience, then what's doing the ultimate watching? What's the awareness in which even the sense of being an observer appears and disappears? You cannot answer this question conceptually without creating another layer of conceptualization that will itself need to be seen through. But you can rest in the question, live inside it, let it dissolve the boundaries between observer and observe that consciousness initially created. This is not a technique or a practice you can do deliberately, because doing it deliberately maintains the doer, the one who's trying. It's more like a spontaneous recognition that sometimes happens when you've exhausted yourself trying, when you've seen through so many layers that you finally give up trying to see through anything and just let yourself be, however you are, without improvement or resistance. In this giving up, which is not a giving up of effort, so much as a giving up of the one who effortedly tries, something shifts. The costs that consciousness exacted, the loss of innocence, the burden of self-awareness, the exile from unself-conscious living, are still there, but they're no longer quite so heavy. They're just facts of your existence, not problems that need to be solved. You're still watching yourself live, but the watching has become lighter, more spacious, less implicated in judgment and evaluation. You find that you can be self-conscious and present at the same time, that the watching doesn't have to create distance if you're not trying to use the watching to get somewhere else, to become someone better, to achieve some state of permanent awakening. The watching becomes just another part of what's happening, like sounds, or sensations, or thoughts. It's not you watching your experience, it's just watching happening, experience appearing to itself as both subject and object simultaneously. A strange loop that doesn't need to be resolved or transcended, but only recognized for what it is. This recognition doesn't solve the practical problems that consciousness creates. You're still going to struggle with decisions, still going to question your motives, still going to feel the burden of responsibility and the weight of awareness. But the struggle happens in a different context. It's no longer struggle against reality, but struggle within reality, part of the whole movement of life rather than your personal problem that separates you from life. You begin to see that consciousness, with all its costs, has also given you something precious that you couldn't have appreciated without first paying the price. It's given you the capacity to be with suffering, your own and others, without immediately trying to escape or fix or deny it. It's given you the ability to see through comforting illusions without becoming cynical, to lose your certainties without losing your capacity for commitment, to recognize the constructed nature of meaning without concluding that nothing matters. The world of forms continues to appear, your personality, your story, your relationships, your projects. But they appear now within a spaciousness that wasn't there before, or that was always there but couldn't be recognized until consciousness cleared away the clutter of unconscious beliefs and unexamined assumptions. You're still living a human life with all its complications and contradictions, but you're living it with a kind of knowing participation rather than unconscious identification. This doesn't mean you're always at peace. Consciousness continues to generate its characteristic struggles, but you start to recognize these struggles as part of the human condition rather than evidence that you're doing something wrong, failing at some spiritual test. The anxiety about whether you're present enough, conscious enough, awake enough, this anxiety itself is seen as just another movement in consciousness, not a problem that needs to be solved, but a wave that arises and passes in the ocean of awareness. You find yourself able to function in the world with more effectiveness, despite, or perhaps because of, your awareness of the constructedness of everything. You can participate in relationships, knowing their constructions, and precisely because you know this, you can participate more fully, more playfully, more freely. You can pursue goals knowing they're arbitrary, and precisely because you know this, you can pursue them with less grasping and more enjoyment of the process. The double consciousness that once felt like a curse becomes something more like depth perception. Just as having two eyes gives you three-dimensional vision, having this doubled awareness gives you a kind of dimensional richness to experience. You're in the world and aware of being in the world at the same time, and instead of these two perspectives cancelling each other out, they create a stereoscopic sense of aliveness, a rich texture to experience that wasn't available in either pure unconsciousness or pure detached witnessing. You start to understand, not conceptually but in your bones, what the Zen masters meant by before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The activities are the same, but something fundamental has shifted in the relationship to the activities. You're chopping wood, knowing it's just chopping wood, without loading it with existential significance, but also without dismissing it as mere meaningless activity. It's fully itself, complete as it is, needing nothing added and nothing taken away. This acceptance extends to consciousness itself. You stop fighting against self-awareness, stop trying to return to some imagined state of innocent unconsciousness. You accept that you're a creature who watches itself live, and you let the watching be part of the living rather than separate from it. The cost has been paid, fully paid, and you cannot get a refund. But you discover that you don't want one anymore. The person you were before consciousness awakened feels like a previous incarnation, someone you remember with fondness but no desire to become again. The strange thing you discover, if you go deep enough into this territory that consciousness opens, is that the whole distinction between cost and compensation, between loss and gain, starts to break down. Every step deeper into awareness reveals that you were looking at the situation wrong from the beginning, that there was never a transaction happening, never a trade of one thing for another. Consciousness doesn't take something away and give something else in return. It reveals what was always the case, but couldn't be seen through the fog of unconscious assumption and habitual thinking. You were never the simple, unified self you thought you lost. That innocent person moving through life without self-consciousness was already divided, already performing, already watching themselves in 1,000 unconscious ways. Consciousness didn't create the division. It illuminated a division that was always there. The difference is that now you see it, and seeing it, you're no longer quite so identified with any particular side of the division. You're not the watcher or the watched, but the awareness in which both appear. This realization doesn't make life easier in any conventional sense. You still get tired, sick, frustrated, disappointed. You still have to navigate the complex machinery of human relationship and social existence. You still face the fundamental questions about meaning and purpose that consciousness raises and cannot answer. But you're no longer looking for an answer that will resolve everything, no longer believing that if you just become conscious enough, everything will fall into place and you'll live in permanent peace and clarity. You recognize that consciousness is not a destination, but a quality of the journey. Not a problem to be solved, but a dimension of existence to be explored. The costs you paid were not really costs, but rather the price of admission to a richer, more complex, more honest relationship with reality. And the compensation is not some separate reward, but simply the natural result of living with more awareness, more honesty, more acceptance of what actually is, rather than what you wish things to be. The watching continues. The self-consciousness remains. The questions persist. But they're held now in a larger context, a context that doesn't need them to be resolved in order for life to be workable, even beautiful. You discover that you can live with uncertainty, that you can function without having solid answers, that you can be both lost and found simultaneously, that you can experience the burden of awareness and the lightness of being at the same time without these opposites contradicting each other. You start to see the dark night of consciousness not as a problem to be overcome, but as a permanent feature of the landscape, one pole of an oscillation that includes also moments of clarity, connection, and simple presence. You're not trying to eliminate the dark night, but learning to recognize it as part of the full spectrum of what consciousness brings. Sometimes you're lost in the labyrinth of self-reflection, and sometimes you're resting in simple being, and both are part of the same process, the same journey that has no end, because it was never really going anywhere in the first place. This might sound like resignation or spiritual bypassing, but it's neither. It's more like a fundamental shift in how you relate to your experience. You're not accepting suffering because you're defeated, or because you've given up on the possibility of change. You're accepting the full reality of human consciousness, which includes suffering, includes questioning, includes the peculiar burden of being an animal that knows it's an animal and wonders what that means. And within this acceptance, you find that you're actually more capable of change, more able to grow, more open to transformation. When you're not fighting against the structure of consciousness itself, not trying to become something other than a self-aware creature caught in the human predicament, you have more energy available for actual life, for actual relationship, for actual engagement with the world in all its messy, complicated, beautiful, terrible reality. You notice that the watching, when it's not trying to control or improve or achieve anything, has a quality of tenderness to it. You're watching yourself struggle, and there's compassion in the watching, a kindness toward this being who's trying so hard, who wants so much to understand, who keeps running into the same paradoxes and limitations, but continues anyway. The watcher and the watched start to reconcile, not by merging into some unified state, but by recognizing their essential intimacy, the way they've always been dancing together, creating the strange experience of being a human person in a human body on a planet spinning through space. The costs of consciousness, they're all still there. You've paid them, and you continue to pay them every day. The exile from innocence, the burden of choice, the weight of awareness, the loneliness of being trapped in subjectivity, the exhaustion of constant self-observation, the paralysis of seeing through your own motives, none of this goes away. But it's transfigured somehow by being fully seen, fully accepted, no longer resisted. The costs become just the texture of your particular life, the way red-green color blindness is the texture of some people's vision, or perfect pitch is the texture of some people's hearing. It's how you experience reality, and fighting against it is like fighting against having the particular body you have, the particular brain you have, the particular slice of existence that's been granted to you. You find yourself able to laugh at the cosmic joke of it all. That consciousness emerged in the universe and immediately began questioning itself, watching itself, trying to understand itself, creating elaborate philosophies and spiritual systems to explain itself to itself. The whole thing is absurd, gloriously absurd, and the absurdity itself becomes a kind of joy when you stop taking it so seriously, when you stop believing that your particular consciousness contains the universe's attempt to understand itself and recognize that you're just one of billions of curious apes asking questions into a void that doesn't answer but keeps presenting new questions. The hidden cost of becoming conscious, you finally understand, was never really hidden. It was always in plain sight, evident in every spiritual teaching that warned you the path would be difficult, in every tradition that spoke of dark nights and deserts and abysses. You just couldn't fully understand the cost until you'd paid it, couldn't comprehend what you'd be giving up until it was gone. And now that you've paid it, now that you're standing on the other side of innocence looking back at who you were, you can see that the cost and the prize were always the same thing, that consciousness itself was both the price and the reward, that you were paying with yourself to receive yourself, transformed by the payment into something that can bear the weight of its own awareness. And so you continue, neither enlightened nor unenlightened, neither lost nor found, neither burdened nor free, but simply alive, conscious, human, watching yourself live while living the watching, paying the cost while receiving the compensation, losing everything while gaining nothing except this strange capacity to see it all happening, to know that it's happening, to be aware that you're aware, and to find in that awareness not the answer you were seeking, but something better and worse and more real than any answer could be. The question itself, alive, ongoing, never resolved, but always resolving into this moment, this breath, this mysterious fact of being conscious at all, in a universe that might just as easily have remained forever unconscious, forever silent, forever dark.